August 14th, 1977. Graceland, 3 days before the world would lose the king of rock and roll forever. Elvis Aaron Presley was dying, and everybody knew it except him. Or maybe he did know it, and that's what made everything that happened next so absolutely heartbreaking. It was just past noon when the delivery truck pulled up that long, winding driveway. Nothing unusual about that. Graceland saw deliveries every day. Fan mail, business packages, gifts from around the world. But this delivery was different. The driver carried just one arrangement: white roses. Elegant, pristine, expensive white roses arranged with baby's breath in a crystal vase that caught the Memphis sunlight like it was holding pure magic. No card, no delivery slip. Just a small piece of cream-colored paper tucked between the stems with handwriting so familiar it might as well have been carved into Elvis's heart. Red West, Elvis's bodyguard and one of his oldest friends, signed for the flowers. He'd been working security at Graceland for over a decade, had seen every kind of gift imaginable come through those gates, but something about these flowers made him pause. Maybe it was the way they seemed to glow in that crystal vase. Maybe it was the careful way they'd been arranged, not like a fan arrangement, but like something deeply personal, something that mattered. Red carried them inside, not really thinking about it, planning to add them to the collection of gifts that would eventually make their way to Elvis's attention. But as he walked through the foyer, that small piece of paper fluttered to the ground. He bent to pick it up, and that's when he saw it. The handwriting he'd seen on Christmas cards, birthday notes, and love letters for more than a decade. Priscilla's handwriting, just 2 words written in that elegant script she'd perfected growing up in Germany: "Still yours." Red West had seen Elvis Presley at his highest highs and his lowest lows. He'd been there through the Army years, the Hollywood years, the comeback special, the Vegas years. He'd seen Elvis laugh until he cried and cry until he couldn't breathe. But he had never, not once in all those years, seen what happened when Elvis read those 2 words. Elvis was in the living room, slumped in his favorite chair, still wearing the same clothes he'd worn to bed the night before. His face was puffy, his hair unwashed, his eyes hollow. This wasn't the Elvis the world knew. This was a man who'd been slowly disappearing from himself for months, maybe years. Red walked in with the flowers, the note still in his hand, and said, "Boss, these came for you." Elvis barely looked up, just put 'em with the others. But Red couldn't move. Something about those flowers, about that note, told him this moment mattered more than he understood. "Elvis," he said quietly, "I think you need to see this." He handed over the note. Elvis took it without interest, glanced down, and the change was instant and devastating. His entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face. His hands started shaking so hard Red thought he might drop the paper. "Where did these come from?" Elvis's voice was barely a whisper. "Delivery truck just brought them. No card, just that note." Elvis stared at those 2 words like they held the secrets of the universe. Still yours. After 4 years of divorce, after all the hurt, all the distance, all the silence between them, after everything he'd put her through and everything she'd put him through, still yours. He stood up from that chair like a man in a trance, walked over to where Red had set the flowers, and picked up that crystal vase with hands that were still trembling. He held those white roses like they were made of the most fragile glass in the world. And then Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who'd performed for presidents and packed stadiums with screaming fans, broke down and cried like a child. Not the quiet tears of a man trying to maintain his dignity, not the controlled emotion of someone aware he was being watched. This was raw, broken sobbing that came from somewhere so deep Red didn't even know that place existed in Elvis. Elvis couldn't finish the sentence. He just held those flowers and cried. Red had seen Elvis cry before, but never like this. This was the sound of a man realizing he'd lost the most important thing in his life and maybe, just maybe, discovering it wasn't too late to get it back. Charlie Hodge walked in during the worst of it, took one look at Elvis holding those flowers and crying, and immediately understood they were witnessing something private, something sacred. He started to back out of the room, But Elvis looked up at him with eyes so desperate it broke both men's hearts. She sent me flowers, Charlie. Priscilla sent me flowers. Charlie had been Elvis's friend since the army, had been there through the Priscilla years, had watched their love story unfold and fall apart. He understood the magnitude of this gesture in a way outsiders never could. "What do you want to do, Elvis?" Elvis wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to pull himself together, but his voice was still thick with emotion. "I want to put them by the piano." The piano. Of course it would be the piano. That's where Elvis went when the world got too heavy, when the pills couldn't quiet his mind, when he needed to find himself again. That piano had heard more of Elvis's secrets than any human being ever had. He carried those flowers like a man carrying his newborn child, placed them carefully on the piano bench where he could see them while he played. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows made those white roses look almost ethereal, like they weren't quite of this world. Elvis sat down at that piano and started to play, not the songs his fans expected, not the hits that made him famous. He played the songs that belonged to him and Priscilla. "Love Me Tender," the song he'd sung to her when she was just a teenager living in his house, learning to love him. "Can't Help Falling in Love," their wedding song, the promise they'd made to each other when they thought love could conquer anything. Red and Charlie watched from the doorway as Elvis played and sang in a voice so broken and beautiful it didn't sound human. He played every song that had ever meant something to them, and with each melody, more of the real Elvis came back. Not the Elvis who performed for crowds, but the Elvis who'd fallen in love with a 14-year-old girl and never stopped loving her, even when loving her meant letting her go. The sun set, the house grew quiet around them, Elvis kept playing. Somewhere around midnight, Red checked on him one more time. Elvis was still at that piano, still singing softly to those white roses, tears still streaming down his face, but something had changed. There was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in months. "Boss, you should get some sleep." Elvis looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, a real smile. "She still loves me, Red. After everything I put her through, everything I became, she still loves me." Red nodded, though his heart was breaking because he could see what Elvis couldn't. This wasn't just Priscilla saying she loved him. This was Priscilla saying goodbye. Elvis played until dawn, those white roses beside him like silent witnesses to the most important night of his life. He played until his fingers were too tired to find the keys, until his voice was just a whisper, until the flowers began to wilt in the morning light. But something had awakened in Elvis that night, something he thought was dead forever. Hope. To understand why those white roses meant everything to Elvis, you have to go back to October 9th, 1973, the day Priscilla Presley made the hardest decision of her life, and the world got it completely wrong. The headlines screamed about other women, about Elvis's affairs, about irreconcilable differences. The tabloids painted Priscilla as the scorned wife who couldn't handle her husband's wandering eye. They made Elvis look like the typical rock star who'd thrown away his family for fame and cheap thrills. Every single word of it was a lie. The truth happened in their bedroom at Graceland on a Tuesday morning when Elvis thought Priscilla was still asleep. She'd been lying there for 20 minutes, listening to him pace the floor like a caged animal, muttering to himself the way he did when the demons in his head got too loud to ignore. "I'm killing her," he whispered, probably thinking she couldn't hear. "I'm killing everyone I love." Priscilla had been watching Elvis destroy himself for months. The pills that were supposed to help him sleep but kept him wired for days. The eating binges followed by weeks where he'd barely touch food. The wild mood swings that left everyone around him walking on eggshells, never knowing if they'd get the Elvis who lit up every room he entered or the Elvis who raged at shadows only he could see. But it wasn't his self-destruction that broke her heart. It was watching him carry the weight of everyone else's happiness on shoulders that were already buckling under pressure he'd never learned how to handle. She got out of bed that morning and found him in the bathroom, staring at himself in the mirror with an expression she'd never seen before, pure self-hatred. "Elvis, what's wrong?" He turned to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. Not the tears of a man feeling sorry for himself, but the tears of someone who'd finally seen the truth and couldn't bear it. "I did this to you," he said. "Look at what I've done to you." Priscilla looked at herself in that mirror and saw what he was seeing. The woman who used to laugh so easily she could barely catch her breath. The girl who'd once danced around Graceland like it was her own personal fairy tale. That person was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at loud noises, who flinched when people moved too quickly, who'd learned to read Elvis's moods like a survival skill. "You didn't do anything to me, Elvis. We're just going through a rough patch." But Elvis shook his head, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "I'm sick. Something's wrong with me and it's getting worse. I can feel it eating me alive from the inside, and everyone who loves me gets caught in the fire. My mama died worrying about me. My daddy's agging 10 years for every one of mine. And you," he reached out like he wanted to touch her face but stopped himself. "You used to shine, baby. You used to light up every room, and now you look like you're afraid of your own shadow. Because of me, because of what loving me costs." This was the conversation Priscilla never told anyone about. Not her family, not her closest friends, not the lawyers during the divorce proceedings. Because how do you explain that your husband didn't leave you for another woman? He pushed you away because he loved you too much to watch himself destroy you. "That's not true," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew he was right. She had changed. The spontaneous girl who'd fallen in love with Elvis's laugh and his vulnerability had become someone who calculated every word, every reaction, every breath to avoid triggering one of his episodes. "It is true, and you know it," Elvis said. "I see how you look at me sometimes, like you're waiting for me to explode. I see how you've stopped talking about your dreams because you're too busy managing mine. I see how you've made yourself smaller and smaller trying to fit into the space my problems leave for you." The worst part was that he wasn't wrong. Priscilla had given up pieces of herself so gradually she hadn't even noticed until they were gone. Her art, her friends outside of Elvis's world, her own opinions about things that mattered. She'd become an expert at being whatever Elvis needed her to be, and somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten who she was when she wasn't being that. "But I love you," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I know you do, and that's exactly the problem." Elvis sat down on the edge of their bathtub and put his head in his hands. "Your love is the only thing keeping me alive, Scylla. It's also the thing that's killing you." This was the moment that changed everything. Not another woman, not career pressures, not the tabloid stories everyone would blame later. This was Elvis Presley having the most selfless moment of his life, seeing clearly for maybe the first time how his pain was poisoning the person he loved most. "What are you saying?" But Priscilla already knew. She could hear it in his voice, see it in the way he couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm saying maybe you should go. Maybe you should take Lisa Marie and go somewhere I can't hurt you anymore." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Priscilla had ever heard. It stretched between them like a chasm, filled with everything they weren't saying, that they both knew he was right, that staying meant watching him die slowly and taking her down with him, that leaving meant abandoning him when he needed her most. "You want me to leave?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I want you to live." Elvis finally looked up at her, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. "I want you to remember what it feels like to laugh without checking to see if it's too loud. I want you to make decisions based on what you want instead of what might keep me stable. I want you to love someone who makes you bigger instead of smaller." "There is no one else, Elvis. There never could be." "Maybe not right now, but someday, if you let yourself heal from what loving me has cost you, maybe there could be." They sat in that bathroom for 3 hours, talking about things they never had the courage to say out loud. About how Elvis's success had become a prison for both of them. About how the pressures of his career had turned their love into a performance for everyone else's benefit. About how they'd both lost themselves trying to live up to the fairy tale everyone expected them to be. But mostly, they talked about Lisa Marie. About how she deserved a mother who wasn't constantly walking on eggshells and a father who didn't scare her with his unpredictability. About how children learn what love looks like from watching their parents, and what were they teaching her? If I leave, Priscilla said finally, it has to look like it's my choice. I won't have the world thinking you abandoned us. Elvis nodded. The lawyers can make up whatever story they need to. Let them blame me for everything. I can handle that. But here's what destroyed them both. They made this decision out of love. Pure, sacrificial love that put the other person's well-being above their own happiness. Elvis was willing to be painted as the villain if it meant Priscilla could start over. Priscilla was willing to leave the love of her life if it meant he might find peace. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, and the media ran with stories about Elvis's affairs and Priscilla's independence. None of it was true. The truth was much simpler and much more heartbreaking. Sometimes love means walking away. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction, even when that someone is your whole world. Priscilla left Graceland in January of 1973, but she never stopped loving Elvis. She just loved him enough to save herself, hoping that maybe, someday, there would be enough left of both of them to try again. She never told anyone that Elvis called her every single night for the first 6 months after she left, not to beg her to come back, but to make sure she was okay, to make sure she was remembering how to be herself again. Those white roses in August of 1977, they were her way of telling him the truth he'd been too broken to hear when she left. Leaving him hadn't changed how much she loved him. It had just changed how much she was willing to sacrifice for that love. And maybe, just maybe, it was her way of saying that 4 years later, she'd finally figured out how to love him without losing herself. But by then, it was almost too late. At 2:30 in the morning, on August 15, 1977, Elvis Presley did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He picked up the phone and dialed Priscilla's number in Los Angeles. His hands were shaking as he dialed, not from the pills this time, but from something much more powerful: fear, hope, the terrifying possibility that those white roses sitting beside his piano meant what his heart was desperate to believe they meant. The phone rang 3 times before her voice came through, groggy with sleep, but instantly alert, the way mothers learn to be. "Hello, Scylla," that's all he could manage, just her name spoken like a prayer. There was a pause that lasted forever, and Elvis could hear her sitting up in bed, could practically see her running her hand through her hair the way she always did when she was trying to wake up quickly. "Elvis, are you okay? Is Lisa Marie?" "She's fine, everyone's fine, He looked at those roses, wilted now but still beautiful in the lamplight. "I got your flowers." Another silence, this one filled with 4 years of hurt and love, and everything they'd never been able to say to each other. "I wasn't sure you'd understand what they meant." "Still yours," Elvis's voice broke on the words. "After everything I put you through, after all the ways I failed you, you're still mine." Elvis, the way she said his name held everything. Forgiveness, pain, love so deep it had survived divorce and distance and all the reasons they'd had to let each other go. "You never failed me. You saved me. You loved me enough to let me go when I needed to find myself again." This was the conversation that should have happened 4 years ago, the one they'd both been too broken to have when she left Graceland. But now, sitting in the dark with those white roses as his only witness, Elvis finally understood what Priscilla had been trying to tell him all along. "I've been thinking about that morning," he said. "When we talked about you leaving, I thought I was doing the right thing, pushing you away to save you. But I wonder sometimes if I was just being a coward, if I was giving up on us because fighting for us felt too hard." "You weren't being a coward, Elvis. You were being honest about something most people never have the courage to face. Sometimes love means walking away from the person you can't live without." Elvis closed his eyes and let her words wash over him. For 4 years, he'd carried the weight of their divorce like a failure, like proof that he destroyed everything good in his life. But hearing her say it out loud, that leaving had been an act of love, not defeat, something shifted inside him. "Did it work?" he asked quietly. "Did leaving me help you remember who you were?" Priscilla was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it in years. It took time, a lot of therapy, a lot of crying, a lot of angry phases where I hated you for making me choose between loving you and loving myself. But yes, it worked. I remembered what it felt like to make decisions without calculating how they'd affect your mood. I remembered what it felt like to have opinions about things that didn't revolve around your career. I remembered that I was a person before I became Elvis Presley's wife. And now Elvis barely dared to ask, "Who are you now?" "I'm someone who knows the difference between loving someone and losing herself in someone. I'm someone who can love you completely without disappearing into that love." This was what Elvis had been hoping to hear for 4 years without even realizing it. That Priscilla had found her way back to herself. That his sacrifice, their sacrifice, had meant something. "I've been trying to get clean," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Really clean, not just cutting back or switching pills. I've been thinking about checking into a facility, somewhere private where I can get the help I need without the whole world watching me fall apart." "Elvis," he could hear the tears in her voice now, "that's wonderful. What changed your mind?" "Those flowers, seeing still yours, in your handwriting made me realize something. If you can still love me after everything I've put you through, maybe I'm worth saving. Maybe there's still something left of the man you fell in love with." They talked until the sun came up. About Lisa Marie, who was growing up so fast she barely seemed like the same little girl who used to ride her tricycle through the halls of Graceland. About Priscilla's acting classes and her growing confidence in her own abilities. About Elvis's plans for a comeback that would be different from anything he'd done before: smaller venues, more intimate performances, songs that meant something to him instead of just crowd pleasers. But mostly, they talked about the possibility of trying again, not going backward to who they used to be, but moving forward as the people they'd become. "I'm scared," Elvis admitted, as dawn light began filtering through the windows. "I'm scared I'll fall back into the same patterns. I'm scared I'll hurt you again." "I'm scared too," Priscilla said, "but I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try." Elvis looked at those white roses, now bathed in morning sunlight, and made a decision that would have changed everything if he'd had more time. "When I get out of rehab, when I'm really clean and healthy, I want to court you again. I want to take you on real dates, not just dinner at Graceland with 50 people watching. I want to learn who you are now, not just remember who you used to be. I want to show you that I can love you without needing you, that I can be a partner instead of a patient." "I'd like that," Priscilla whispered. "I'd like that very much." They made plans that morning. Tentative, careful plans, but plans nonetheless. Elvis would check into a private clinic in California within the next 2 weeks. Priscilla would bring Lisa Marie to visit him once he was settled and ready for family contact. They would take things slowly, building trust the way you build a house, one brick at a time, with a solid foundation. After he hung up the phone, Elvis sat at his piano and played every love song he'd ever known, but this time they didn't sound like funeral dirges. They sounded like promises, like possibilities, like hope. He spent the rest of that day making calls. To doctors who specialized in prescription drug addiction. To his manager, telling him to cancel all upcoming performances until further notice. To his lawyer, asking about the fastest way to modify custody arrangements so he could spend more time with Lisa Marie once he was healthy. For the first time in years, Elvis Presley was planning for a future instead of just surviving each day. He wrote letters that day, letters to Priscilla telling her all the things he'd never had the courage to say. Letters to Lisa Marie explaining why Daddy had to go away for a while, but promising her that when he came back, he'd be the father she deserved. Letters to his friends, apologizing for the ways his addiction had hurt them and asking for their support in getting clean. None of those letters were ever sent. Elvis Presley died 16 hours after that phone call with Priscilla, found on his bathroom floor by his girlfriend Ginger Alden, who had no idea that the man she'd been living with had just rediscovered his reason for living. The tragedy wasn't just that Elvis died so young. The tragedy was that he died just as he was ready to fight for his life again. Those white roses had given him something he'd lost years ago, hope that tomorrow could be different from today. The letters were found in his bedroom, sealed and addressed, stacked neatly beside those wilted white roses. In his handwriting, barely legible from exhaustion but unmistakably his, was a note that simply said, "For when I'm ready to come home." Priscilla never knew about those letters until years later. She never knew that their conversation had given Elvis the strength to choose recovery. She never knew that the last conscious decision Elvis Presley made was to get clean so he could love her the way she deserved to be loved. But somewhere in her heart, she must have known something had changed, because the flowers she sent him weren't just about saying, "Still yours." They were about saying goodbye to who they used to be and hello to who they might become. If only there had been more time. August 16th, 1977, the day the music died and Priscilla Presley's real life began. The phone call came at 7:43 in the morning, Los Angeles time. Vernon Presley's voice, broken and barely recognizable, delivering news that would shatter her world. "Priscilla, Elvis is gone." She'd been awake all night anyway, riding the high of their conversation, making her own plans for their future. She'd already called her acting teacher to discuss taking a break from classes. She'd already started thinking about how to prepare Lisa Marie for the possibility of her parents getting back together. She'd been planning a life that would never happen. But here's what nobody understood about Priscilla Presley in that moment. The grief that consumed her wasn't just about losing Elvis. It was about losing the Elvis they were about to become. The clean Elvis, the healthy Elvis, the Elvis who'd finally learned the difference between needing someone and loving someone. The world mourned Elvis Presley, the entertainer, the king of rock and roll, the cultural icon who'd changed music forever. Priscilla mourned Elvis Presley, the man who'd been ready to fight for love one more time, 16 hours too late. The funeral was a circus. Thousands of fans, hundreds of reporters, celebrities and politicians all coming to pay their respects to the legend. But Priscilla barely saw any of it. She kept thinking about those letters they'd found in his bedroom, the ones he'd written but never sent, the ones that proved their phone conversation hadn't been a goodbye, it had been a hello that never got the chance to become anything more. Standing beside Elvis's coffin at Graceland, holding 9-year-old Lisa Marie's hand as she said goodbye to her daddy, Priscilla made a promise that would define the rest of her life. The world could remember Elvis however it wanted to, but she would spend the rest of her days making sure people remembered the Elvis she'd fallen in love with, the Elvis who'd been brave enough to let her go and brave enough to ask her to come back. The problem was, nobody wanted to hear that story. The tabloids were already spinning tales about Elvis's death, focusing on the pills, the weight gain, the decline. They wanted to paint him as a cautionary tale, a talent destroyed by excess and fame. Priscilla found herself fighting a war for Elvis's legacy that most people didn't even know was being fought. She started small, correcting false stories when she could, giving interviews that focused on Elvis's generosity instead of his problems. But the real work began when she realized that Graceland was bleeding money and would have to be sold if something didn't change quickly. Everyone told her to sell. Elvis's business advisors, her own family, even some of Elvis's friends thought it was time to let go. "It's just a house, Priscilla. You can't live in the past forever." But they didn't understand what Graceland represented. It wasn't just Elvis's home, it was the place where he'd been most himself, where he'd played with Lisa Marie, where he'd written songs in the middle of the night, where he'd sat at that piano and dreamed of being clean enough to deserve love again. Opening Graceland to the public in 1982 was the most terrifying decision Priscilla had ever made. She was essentially inviting the world into the most private moments of their life together. But it was also the most important decision she ever made, because it allowed people to see Elvis as he really was. Not the sequined performer on stage, but the man who'd collected badges from police departments across the country because he wanted to help people. The man who'd given away cars to strangers because making people happy made him happy. The first day Graceland opened for tour, Priscilla walked through the house with the first group of visitors. She watched them discover Elvis's kitchen still set up the way he'd left it. His bedroom, preserved exactly as it had been. The jungle room where he'd recorded some of his final albums. But it was when they reached the music room, where his piano still sat, that Priscilla broke down. Because sitting there, in a place of honor, was a crystal vase. Empty now, but polished to perfection. The same vase that had held those white roses. "Ma'am, are you all right?" One of the visitors, an elderly woman from Alabama, touched Priscilla's arm gently. "I'm fine," Priscilla managed. "It's just, this room holds a lot of memories." "Good ones, I hope," the woman said. Priscilla looked around the room, remembering Elvis sitting at that piano all night, playing love songs to wilted flowers, planning a future he'd never get to live. "Yes," she said finally, "good ones." That's when Priscilla understood what her real job was going to be. Not just preserving Graceland as a museum, but preserving the truth of who Elvis was. The complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking truth that couldn't be summed up in tabloid headlines or greatest hits collections. Over the years, she turned Graceland into more than just a tourist attraction. It became a place where people could understand Elvis's humanity, where they could see his generosity, his struggles, his love for his family, his desire to make the world a better place. She made sure the tour included stories about his charity work, his love for his fans, his devotion to his daughter. But the most important thing Priscilla did was something almost nobody knew about. Every year on August 14th, the anniversary of those white roses, she would go to Graceland alone. She would sit at Elvis's piano and place fresh white roses in that crystal vase, and she would talk to him. She would tell him about Lisa Marie's accomplishments, about her grandchildren who never got to meet their grandfather but carried pieces of his spirit. She would tell him about the letters fans still sent, thanking him for music that had gotten them through dark times. She would tell him about the changes in the world, the good and the bad, the things he would have loved and the things that would have broken his heart. And sometimes, when the anniversary fell on a particularly difficult year, she would tell him the truth she'd never been able to say out loud to anyone else. That losing him had taught her the difference between surviving and living, and that everything good in her life since then had been built on the foundation of love he'd given her, even when that love meant letting go. The Elvis Presley that Priscilla preserved for the world wasn't the perfect man the fans wanted him to be, or the tragic figure the media had painted him as. It was the real man who'd struggled with demons but never stopped trying to be better, who'd made mistakes but never stopped loving the people in his life, who died too young but had lived long enough to show the world what it meant to love someone more than you loved yourself. Today, millions of people visit Graceland every year. They come for different reasons, some for the music, some for the history, some just out of curiosity. But they all leave understanding something important about Elvis Presley that the tabloids never captured. They leave understanding that he was human, beautifully, tragically, gloriously human. And in a world that often demands perfection from its heroes, maybe that's the most important legacy of all. Maybe the greatest love story isn't about two people who lived happily ever after, but about two people who loved each other enough to keep loving even when everything else fell apart. Priscilla Presley spent 46 years protecting that truth, and every August 14th, she still sends flowers to Graceland. White roses, still yours. This story shows us that the greatest love stories aren't always the ones with happy endings, but the ones where love transcends everything else. If Elvis and Priscilla's hidden truth touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know in the comments what other untold celebrity love stories you'd like us to uncover.